No, that's okay. That's okay. Right. Thank you very much for coming. This is a topic I've been kind of presenting at, I think now 10 or so conferences. It's something that I've been doing for quite a long time. There's a lot of material that I've been gathering over the years. And I could probably end up talking to you for about 4 or 5 hours straight. So at any point, I'll try to keep it within an hour. If you see me going off at a tangent, just, wave and I'll try to return back here. If there's any questions during the slides, I'd rather you shout them out. We can make it a bit interactive, especially as a smaller crowd, we can keep it a little bit interactive, but we will do a Q&A at the end. So what we'll do is about an hour-ish, giving my propensity for ranting and stuff. And then probably a little break if you want, or a little Q&A. We'll just play it by ear and see how we go. So, get in touch here, introduction to touch and pointer events. A lot of this stuff that I'll be showing you, most of the examples that I'll show you, they're all on GitHub, so you can use that at your own leisure. But really what triggered this was a few years ago when I still worked for Opera, and I was doing a lot of mobile kind of development stuff, giving advice to developers. One of the questions that came about 2 years ago is a lot of developers asking me, what can I do now to make sure that on touch devices my websites work or work well? And usually the advice is you don't actually need to do anything special. You don't need things like touch events and stuff like that. Because browsers on mobile devices, on phones, tablets, etc., they're actually built to run the web as it is today. Obviously, there's a lot of legacy web sites that pretty much rely on things like mouse events. So if your website relies on mouse interactions, these browsers are actually set out, built so that they can, at least to a certain extent, run those pages and give you a reasonable experience. So if your website doesn't do anything too fancy, if it's just links, maybe a few forms and that sort of stuff, you pretty much don't have to listen to anything I say in the next hour or so. But there are some limitations, and that's where things like touch events will come in, and we'll cover those in a little bit. So, as an example, I'm not going to do these interactively, otherwise it will take about 3 hours. One of many examples, iterations that I've been doing is building little test pages and just seeing what kind of events are being fired on a variety of devices. I've got a little mini test lab with far too many devices stuck in a box somewhere at home, and I pull them all out because I've got nothing else to do with my life, and run these tests and kind of make notes on what events are being fired. And you'll see that for the most basic stuff, there's a test button. I just listen to all the different mouse events, and you'll see that, yes, even on a nominally touch-only device, you tap a button and you'll see that mouse events and the click at the end are being fired. This is usually the sequence of events, and I spend a lot of time looking at sequence of events. As I said, I am a sad bastard when it comes to that. This is what you generally get on the majority of devices, mobile devices, different browsers, different OSs. You tap on something on the screen and you get, on some of them you get a mouse enter, and some of them you don't. It's similar to desktop where you might get normally with a mouse enter or a mouse leave. You don't get that in every browser. Then you get a mouse over, a single mouse move, I call it a sacrificial mouse move, just in case there are any scripts that are listening to that particular thing. Browsers fire a single mouse move, a mouse down, focus in some cases, not all browsers do that, mouse up and click. So it almost pretends basically when you tap that the mouse has moved to it, the user pressed down, up, and then the click event fires. Obviously it wouldn't be fun if it wasn't a bit more complex. Well, the majority of differences come from the setting of focus. If you tap the first time, that's the event sequence you get. The second time around, the browser will assume you're already focused on that thing, so it won't try to send another focus. So it gets mouse move, mouse down, mouse up, and click. And if you then tap away from that particular element, from the button in my examples, you get generally a mouse out, and if the browser was one of those that sets a focus, it will also set a blur. So it's still fairly sane, but this is the kind of sequence that you get. You get all these events, you get them fired in very rapid succession, like a few milliseconds between them. There are differences, so focus blurs only sent, I think, last time I checked it was Firefox, but I've done more testing since then, so this might need to be updated. Mouse out is not fired on iOS Safari or embedded web views like iOS Chrome, but in general, this is the kind of lay of the land. If your site is reacting to those mouse events, even on a touch device, you're reasonably safe that you don't have to actually do any extra work. So emulation works, but it's limiting and problematic. And if you come across certain more specific cases and you just want to rely on mouse, you're going to have a bad time on touch devices. There's three kind of broad areas. The second one I'm only going to skim over because I could spend, yet again, loads of time on it. But there are three kind of main things that I want to mention. There's delayed event dispatch, mouse-specific interfaces, and the fact that mouse move doesn't track. Well, you already had the hint there before. There's a single sacrificial mouse move being fired, but mouse move doesn't track if you move the finger around. It doesn't fire multiple mouse moves, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, having a look quickly at delayed event dispatch, and this is probably about 2/3 of the presentation because it's such a long topic. So, deep breath, and we're going to jump into that. So, we've seen that this example here where it fires mouse events, but as some of you may already experience, when you tap on a touchscreen device, you get a little delay before, say, the click event itself is being fired at the end. The delay is usually in the range of about 300 milliseconds, plus minus whatever, depending on the phase of the moon, but it's pretty much there. And we'll see why it's there. It's something that developers don't like when there's a lot of discussions about native versus web-based application development. One of the first things that developers say is, well, I've got to wrangle with that 300 milliseconds. It's not a lot, 300 milliseconds, but it's enough to make you feel that the app that you want to build, the web app, isn't as responsive as, say, a native application where you tap something and things immediately start going off. So this is only giving you a flavour of them, and then we'll jump back in. Mouse-specific interfaces, I'm not going to run it live, but things where, it's just one example of many, websites where if you're moving with a mouse over something, you get extra information, specifically with content and new interface elements come up. That can be problematic, or is problematic, on touchscreen devices, because touchscreen devices don't have a concept in general of a hover. So there is, part of the problem here is more of a UX problem. Do you want things that happen on mouse over or not? That's a whole different debate, but we'll have a look at what the problem there is as well. And as I said, mouse move doesn't track, and this one I'm actually going to run it live here. If you indulge me. And yes, this is a touch laptop, that's the only reason why I'm running on Windows, for those who are wondering. And then I usually spend about an hour trying to find the right one. There we go. Oh, no, this is a different one, but same thing. This is something that reacts on mouse move, silly kind of canvas-based experiment. It works great on, if I'm using the mouse. Now, if I'm using touch, you'll see that it works if I tap and let go, because that one sacrificial mouse move is being fired. But if I just put my finger down and try swiping over things, it doesn't work, because mouse move isn't fired every time the finger moves. It only really fires it at those specific points, and only a single one. So if you've got an interface, something more useful than this kind of pop art shine to the canvas, then you're going to have problems running it on a touch device, because if you're listening to mouse move, because mouse move doesn't track. Right. And, yeah. So yeah, the example would be if I ran it on an actual mobile device, but it's the same thing. Same with the touch here on the screen. Every now and again you'll see I also file loads of bugs against browsers all the time as I'm doing all this testing, so links to things that don't quite work in specific browsers. Right, so we've seen those are the three kind of main problems that I'm just going to mention. How to solve them? Well, we need to go deeper. We can't just rely just on the mouse emulation layer that is built into the mobile browsers, touchscreen browsers, and we need to go a little deeper. And to do that, there's a whole new class, well I say new, it's been a few years now, a class of JavaScript events, touch events that were first introduced in iOS 2, so they're kind of an Apple invention. They were then adopted by Chrome, Firefox, Opera, the various other browsers on touchscreen devices, and it was retrospectively specified as a W3C spec. Apple wasn't happy about that. They did a bit of noise about patterns, as they always do, but in the end it was all good, and we've got an actual retrospective specification that says what these touch events are. In short, you get a whole new class of events: touch start, touch move, touch end, touch cancel, touch enter, touch leave. Fairly, straightforward. Touch start is when the finger gets onto the touch screen. Touch move is when it moves. Touch end when you lift the finger. Touch cancel is fired if something happens that interrupted the touch. So it could be, I don't know, if you're long pressing on something and the browser itself brings up a native dialog that says you want to copy, paste, blah, blah, blah. That's usually when you get touch cancel being fired at your page, at your JavaScript. Touch enter, touch leave are kind of the equivalent of mouse enter, mouse leave. Not every browser fires them. Not every browser on the touch screen fires them. But that's the kind of the idea that as you're moving your finger, it would fire these as it enters or leaves the kind of the borders of a particular element. But it's still a little bit flaky as it is on desktop if you're just doing things like mouse enter, mouse leave. Similar situation. Of course, if we look at the sequence of events, we've seen that, yes, mouse events are being fired. Where are these touch events being fired? Running the tests, we'll see that, I think the next slide actually has it in big. We'll see that as you're tapping, say, on a button, what you get is you get touch start, a few touch moves if you're a little bit shaky with your finger, you haven't had a cigarette in the morning or too much coffee, but only a few. Touch end as you're kind of lifting your finger, and then you get the series of mouse events that we saw before, the compatibility mouse events and the final click. If you move your finger too much as you're tapping, the browser doesn't think it's a tap anymore, and it will abort after you lift the finger. It won't send the mouse sequence or the click. So testing has been a bit of a challenge doing this sort of thing. Also, this sequence is only fired when you're using a single finger. Particularly mouse compatibility events are only fired if you're using a single finger. If there's a second finger that happens to get onto the screen, go on.
I just wondered, you mentioned about touch cancel and touch end.
Mm-hmm.
Which one would fire when you go off the screen?
Off the screen, it should in theory be touch cancel, but it might just silently not send anything anymore. That's the kind of those edge cases where the browsers do weird things that keep me interested. So yeah, if you've got more than one finger, it doesn't count anymore as being, oh, this is a tap, and the user wants to probably get the mouse compatibility events at the end. Again, if it's the first time you tap, you get a certain sequence. If it's a second tap on the same element, you get a slightly different sequence. Again, it's mainly to do with not faking that the mouse enters the element, because it kind of pretends that it's already there and it's been placed there the second time you tap, and the focus kind of stuff is being fired. Tapping away, same kind of thing. A few notes, again, too many touch moves will abort the whole thing. Depending on the browser, again, if you move too much, it might even fire a touch cancel, assuming that the whole touch gesture wasn't actually a tap anymore. But not all browsers fire these things consistently, and that's where it starts to get interesting in those comments. So a few kind of bizarre things that I've seen, but I've got a link, there's many more things that are weird in this world, is browser even on Android 4.3, so not the super old one, but a reasonably common one. You get mouse over and mouse move first, then you get touch start, touch end, and then some more mouse events. Reason for that, nobody knows, and for the 5 people in the world that have got a BlackBerry Playbook, one of them being me, you get touch start, and then a few mouse things, and then touch end and mouse up and click. So the kind of takeaway from that, we'll see more of this kind of weirdness, is yes, I told you all this is the sequence of events, don't rely on it too much. Just take it as, this, to give you an idea of these are the kind of events that are being fired. But there will always be devices and browsers and OSs that do something slightly different, which keeps our job interesting. So, we've seen touch events, and we've seen the limitations before, that delay and stuff like that. How can touch events actually help us overcome some of these problems? So again, as a reminder, those are the 3 things. Delayed event dispatch, and we've seen that we've got that 300-ish millisecond delay. So first of all, why is the delay actually there? Why do we have that we're tapping on something, browser waits 300 milliseconds before it fires mouse stuff and then click at the end? Well, mostly it's to do with double tap to zoom, because a single finger on a touch device is actually quite overloaded in terms of what we do with it. We use it to tap on things, we use it to scroll things, and if we double tap, we want to normally zoom into something. Now with a double tap in particular, if I tap and then lift my finger off the touch screen, the browser doesn't know at that point, is there a second tap that's about to come? So that's why the browsers usually wait about 300 milliseconds. If no second tap is detected, the browser will assume, okay, it was a tap rather than the first part of the double tap action, and then we'll go and catch up with itself and fire all the events and click at the end. Interesting thought experiment. A lot of people say, well, browsers shouldn't do that. Who cares? What happens when browsers don't wait for that? There's a weird example. I grant you, it's not something that a lot of people use for here. But there's a browser on Android called Puffin. Again, that shows how sad I am. Actually go and find these browsers. It's popular in Korea, apparently. And this implements both double tap to zoom, but doesn't implement the delay. So you get into interesting situations where I can double tap on my test button, it will zoom in, and at the same time it fires the events. So depending on what your page actually does, with a click event, it might start zooming and then all of a sudden load another page, so weird things can happen. It also has, it's a very interesting one, you can also switch it to virtual mouse mode. If you're bored, just grab that on Android and have a play with it. Go on.
Can you affect the delay with the viewport? Initial scale and max scale?
Yes, we'll get to that. So. You're getting ahead of myself. Right, so when does the delay actually happen? Go on.
Sorry, I thought you were
No, that's okay.
When and by who was it standardised, the rough amount of time for the delay? Is it something that just kind of...
It wasn't standardised, it's not in the standard either. It's, I think Apple were the first ones that did it on iOS, and then it became kind of a de facto-y thing. As I said, it's not always 300 milliseconds, but I think it's close enough that every browser kind of copied that particular sensible setting. So when does this delay actually happen? We know it's there, we know we want to, we don't like it because it makes our things not feel responsive enough. When does it actually happen? So again, testing, and we'll see that in the sequence of events, including the touch events and the fake mouse events and the click, oops, I thought I had it in actual sequence. We'll see we see that first you get the touch events, it's a little bit smaller, grant you. Then you get the 300 millisecond delay, and then you get the mouse compatibility events and the click at the end. So how can I make it feel more like a responsive or native app, my web application? Well, the simple answer is react to events fired before the 300 millisecond delay. React to say touch start, we know that touch start, as soon as the user touches the screen, for immediate control, so things like, I don't know, if you're doing a game, for the fire button, you don't want to wait till the user presses and then releases the button, you want to do it as soon as the finger touches the screen. Touch end for the more traditional kind of things. Quick interlude, but we'll get back to the main thread right away. There's a simple way to feature detect for touch events. There's a variety of approaches, particularly with older, flakier browsers. You have to use some hacks. But the cleanest way to do it in modern browsers is if on touch start or on touch end, those various things, is in the window object, then you know touch events are there. Now, that's a fairly useful little thing, but a common performance trick that I still see out and about on the web is something like this. So I'll talk you through that. It basically does the check. Are there touch events? And if so, it listens to touch end, otherwise it listens to click. So I've got, say, a function, it's supposed to do something. Touch events are supported in this browser, great. I'll only listen to touch end, I'll avoid the 300 millisecond delay. Otherwise, it might be a desktop machine, I'll listen to click. Well, it's a great performance trick, but it is, faulty. Because what you end up doing in that situation is making things touch exclusive. And I've written about this at length about a year ago, I think now. Oh yeah, April 9. On Hacks Mozilla, but in effect, it's based on a wrong assumption that you're making with that particular feature detect. If on touch start is in window, doesn't mean that I'm on a device that has a touch screen only, and the user's only going to use the touch screen. It basically just says, this browser supports touch events, nothing more, nothing less. And maybe a few years ago, it was true that the only browsers that supported touch events were, in fact, things like, an iPhone or iPad or something like that. But now we're getting a lot of hybrid devices. I've got one right here, where you get touch and mouse and keyboard. And the user might even be switching between these modes. I might be using the mouse for some stuff, for other stuff I might be using the touch screen, or switch back to the keyboard, etc. Those various transformer laptops, even those weird laptops that actually run Android but have a keyboard and everything else. Those are bizarre hybrid devices. Even further back, HTC Hero with a little trackball thing there. That's another hybrid device. It has a touch screen, but it also can use a mouse. So, also, nominally mobile devices, so a tablet or a phone, that can be paired with things like a Bluetooth mouse or a Bluetooth keyboard. So I've done some tests as well. What kind of events are being fired? In some situations you're okay. If you're assuming, okay, I'm just going to listen to touch events. If I've got a mouse with an Android device, it behaves pretty much like touch. It sends the same kind of touch start, touch end, etc. So you've got a weird situation where you have a mouse that pretends to be a finger, so the browser sends touch events and then emulates mouse events for compatibility reasons. But if you're making the assumption of if it supports touch events, I'll just listen to touch end. In this case, you get away with it. Which device is that? Android and keyboard, that's another common scenario. It will only fire focus and click, so if you're using tab and shift tab, like on a normal desktop machine, to move your focus around the page, then use enter or space, we'll just fire click, so no touch events being fired in this case. So with the naive kind of approach, you've already killed, say, okay, admittedly a small kind of percentage of potential users, but those who are using a keyboard paired with a touch device. Next one. Now, iOS doesn't let you normally pair a mouse. Well, no, mouse not at all, ever. It lets you pair a keyboard with a device like an iPhone, but the keyboard itself, you can't actually control anything. It's only active in the same situations where the on-screen keyboard would come active. So if you're typing the URL or something. However, if you enable VoiceOver, the built-in screen reader stuff, you can also use the keyboard to navigate web pages and everything else. And again, in those situations, keyboards with iOS and VoiceOver, yes, it's similar to touch. The event sequence is slightly bizarre. It's kind of a weird amalgam of what you get with keyboard and what you get with touch. But yeah, it still fires touch events. So you're safe-ish. There's a whole other aspect to the testing, a complete mobile device, touchscreen device, but using VoiceOver, blind user or vision impaired user with VoiceOver. What events are being fired there? Again, you're safe, and I'm assuming that was designed on purpose by Apple, so that sites that do things like only listen to touch end will actually work. It will fire touch events, but there are combinations where that's not the case. Android and TalkBack, its own equivalent screen reading software, it will fire a hybrid of keyboard and mouse, no touch events inside. So again, if you're doing the naive assumption of it supports touch events that only listen to touch end, this is another group of users that pretty much can't use your page, your web app. And since doing most of those slides, I've actually spent a lot of time doing a whole battery of tests with various combinations of browsers and operating systems and assistive tech. So if you're really bored and you can't get to sleep at night, have a look at that page. An entire compatibility table of all these are the events that have been fired in this situation, with this browser, with this assistive tech running, etc. But the outcome of that really is that doing the naive assumption will stop certain users from being able to actually use your site. So really it's about expanding the idea more. It's not about thinking in terms of it's either touch or mouse or keyboard users, but it's really about anybody can be using any of these modalities, sometimes interchangeably, sometimes on the same device that might be switching between them. I mean, another device where the whole touch end thing would fail dramatically is on this. I think I've got a demo later I can show you if you're interested, but this supports touch events, obviously, on the device. But if I code my page just to listen to touch ends, all of a sudden I can't use the trackpad or the keyboard. But I can give you an example of that later. So instead of doing it's either touch end or click, the kind of general solution for that is you double up your event listeners. For those who've done stuff for accessibility reasons, looking at mouse-specific stuff, making it work for keyboard, that's nothing new. Same kind of idea. Instead of just doing either touch end or click, you pretty much hook up your same function or similar function to both types of events. Now, if you do that, the only problem you've got is that we can react to touch end on a touch device, but we know that later on there will be a 300 millisecond delay, and then click is fired, and you might end up firing things twice. So no big surprise that you can use a prevent default on the, oh, it still says touch start there, but I meant to say touch end. You can actually prevent those mouse compatibility events from firing. If you're reacting already to the touch stuff, you can say, right, I've got it, I'm handling it, don't do your compatibility events, I've got it. And so with this kind of approach, all of a sudden your script runs in all situations, whether it's click being fired by a user with a mouse or a user with a keyboard, or a user on a touchscreen but with those combinations of AT and various other things, external inputs, that only fire click rather than touch events. And you're also reacting to touch events where available, and you're avoiding the 300 millisecond delay. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Being careful with the prevent default, we've seen it, it's useful for stopping the browser from running its mouse compatibility events, which is great. But by doing prevent default, you're basically saying to the browser, I'm handling everything from this point on. Which means you're killing scrolling, you're killing pinch zooming, everything else. So it's a big hammer. Use it, very surgically. Using a hammer surgically. You know what I mean. So don't apply to the entire page. If it's only, say, a certain button that you want to make sure that it reacts well, just apply that prevent default just to that particular button, not to the entire page. Otherwise, you have to re-implement scrolling by hand, and nobody's got time for that stuff. There are edge cases where on certain browsers, particularly older versions of Android, and if it's a button rather than a link, browsers do weird things. There's a lot of edge cases, so this was my idealized version. If you don't want to end up researching all those situations, there's a nice ready-made script from the folks that make the Financial Times web app, which is, well, it's their kind of Android app, they call it, but it's actually just a website. They've had to deal with all that kind of latency stuff, 300 millisecond delay. They've put their script up. It covers pretty much what we've seen, but covers all the other edge cases as well. So if you want to do a quick and easy, right, I want to kill those 300 milliseconds in my application, go and grab this. You don't have to worry too much about coding it from basic principles. And as was already given away before, browsers are working to actually remove this delay when possible. So we've seen that the delays may be there for double tap to zoom. In situations where zooming doesn't make sense or is not allowed, for instance, if you're adding a meta viewport of user scalable no, browsers, or some browsers, optimize the delay away. Chrome was the first one that aggressively removed these kind of delays in these situations. Firefox has most of these situations now built in as well. Safari is the one that isn't doing it, and we'll see why in a second. So if your site, I mean, it's something that you shouldn't really do, preventing the user from zooming, but if you do, then there's no 300 millisecond delay. So without having to mess with preventing default and all that kind of stuff, or listening to touch end, in this case, you could even just listen to click, knowing that there is no 300 millisecond delay. Same difference if you're not saying it's not user scalable, no, but you're saying that the minimum and maximum scale are the same. Effectively, you're saying the same thing. That's also a situation where there's no delay. You could argue, well, I will argue that is an accessibility problem if you're just stopping your user from being able to zoom. Now in Chrome, and I believe in browser, the generic one from old Android days, there is actually a setting that the user can set, saying force enable zoom, or allow zooming, or whatever it's called in browser itself. That will, even on pages that do those tricks with a viewport, it will let you zoom. The end result is, though, that the delay comes back. And I think that's a fair kind of compromise. If you want to, well, depends how you justify it. But if you say, okay, well, I know that I'm stopping users from zooming, but it's to make the app faster. If the user really needs it, they can enable it, but they'll have to live with 300 millisecond delay. But not every browser has that setting, so it's not a valid excuse in my court to say, no, that's why we just stopped people from zooming. But, you know, it's worth being aware. Firefox on Android, I think, yeah, that's it. Same thing, does the same stuff, user scalable no, or minimum and maximum scale being the same. Firefox OS didn't have that, and I found a bug, and they've resolved and fixed it. So, again, for those 5 people that are switching now from their playbook to a Firefox OS device, they can, in the later versions, also have this kind of fix. So if the page isn't zoomable, there won't be a 300 millisecond delay. Now, as I said, Chrome are the ones that are really aggressively trying to optimize away these things, because obviously they're, well, Google have got vested interest in making web apps as powerful as possible, you know, rivaling native apps, because they've got a few irons in the fire with Chrome OS, that sort of stuff, where they're all betting on web technologies, making their browser the actual platform. So they were the first ones to go a little bit further and say, if the site actually says width equals device width, supposedly a mobile optimized view, then they also remove the 300 millisecond delay. So this is kind of a weird one, because width device width is kind of a magic incantation for a lot of developers. They take it, they put it in their page. There might still be content that's too small, but Chrome doesn't let you double tap to zoom in that situation. However, it still lets you pinch zoom, which is, again, kind of a compromise. You'll have to work out if that's what you know, if that's acceptable. And just today I found out, so I didn't put it in my slides, but Firefox have also just closed their equivalent bug that also says, Firefox will also do this. Once you get width equals device width, it will also optimize away the 300 millisecond delay. So there is quite a bit of movement in the various browsers to basically get rid of this 300 mil without having developers have to do it, because some of the developers then trip on their own feet and then do weird things that stops people from using their site. And it's a pain, admittedly, if you want to always include a shim that removes that 300 millisecond delay. Now, the odd one out, as in many cases when it comes to standards, is Safari. No matter what you throw at Safari, whether it's preventing zooming or various other things, Safari will always have that 300 millisecond delay. So I went off and actually found a bug on WebKit saying, well, all these other browsers are doing this, why aren't you guys doing it? Guys and girls. And basically, the answer, the surprising answer is, who here has an iPhone? Just out of interest, okay. Who here knows about double tap to scroll? Any of you used it? No? Okay. So that's what I thought too. But yeah, the reason why Safari isn't doing this in WebKit is the very important double tap to scroll scenario, where if you're in a page, even if it's set not to zoom, you can double tap to scroll your viewport. Feature that no end user actually knows about. It's not in any user documentation. But that's the reason why they can't kill the 300 millisecond delay, even when there's no zooming, because they have to wait and see if the user wants to double tap to scroll. So last time I checked, it was closed. I don't know if I updated this slide. No, I didn't. But yeah, it was closed last time I looked at this. Go on.
How does that feature work? You double tap and then what happens after that?
Well, if you double tap, say, 2/3 down the page, it will try and scroll that to the middle of your screen. See? Very important feature. That's why they can't do that. Okay. So yeah, all the nice things we've seen. You can do this. You can do that to remove the 300 millisecond delay. You still have to contend with Safari not doing it. Go on.
Surely, being Apple, they're slurping everything from every user anyway. Don't they have the stats for how often that isn't used in the first place to be able to say, kill it?
You'd think so. But then Apple have always had a weird relationship with their web browser because they always got some kind of app store idea where they try to actually push native as the solution for things. So sometimes you think that they're doing it on purpose not to make their browser do certain things. But as Apple never comment on things or go to conferences, we'll never know. Right, so any questions about delayed event dispatch? As you've seen, this is I could talk all night just about that. But right, so mouse-specific interfaces, I'm not going to delve too deeply into it. As we've seen, stuff where you move your mouse over and new interface elements pop up. They don't work well or at all on touch devices because there is no real concept of hovering on a device. You're either touching the screen or you're not touching the screen. With a few exceptions, iOS fakes this idea of hovering, and we'll see in a second how and why. And then I actually tested this myself recently, the Galaxy S4 and Galaxy Notes 2 or 3 with a stylus, not with a finger, with a stylus. If you're hovering the stylus just above the touch screen, it will also register it as a hover, and it will actually fire mouse over events, which is bizarre. But that's only one device, well, only one class of devices does it. So in general, this still holds true. On touch devices, you haven't really got a concept of hover. You're either touching it or you're not touching it. Now, on iOS, they do a little bit of weird heuristic stuff in their pages. You might have seen, if you've tried things like drop-down menus on sites, that in Safari and, well, any browser that uses WebView on iOS, they kind of work most of the time. And that's because they actually crowbar some functionality into the browser that says, once the user lifts the finger, check if anything's changed in the page at all. it starts firing the mouse events. You've got the touch events at the top. Once it starts firing the mouse over and mouse move, it just looks, is anything changing in the page as a reaction to the mouse over or the mouse move? Did some CSS come into life, or did a new element come into the DOM? Anything mutated in the page? If so, stop at that point. So, in most cases, if your, say, drop-down menu appears on hover, this will actually trigger it and then it will stop. It won't carry on with the mouse down, mouse up, and click. That usually then breaks the whole way those pop-up things work. So on iOS, they've got a lot of heuristics into their browser. Doesn't always work. There's a whole, I think, PPK, for those who read his stuff, has done some research. He's even more obsessed with some of these aspects than me in certain situations, where depending on how you generate new elements, sometimes iOS sees them, sometimes it doesn't. So it's a weird heuristic that they built in. But in general, again, this is only valid for Safari and WebView on iOS. Any other browser, say on Android, Firefox OS, all of those other platforms, doesn't do this. So it's not something you can rely on in general for your website. If your website uses hover-based stuff, it might be time to kind of rethink that approach if you want to make it work on all mobile devices. Now, there's a lot of discussion, or there was a lot of discussion about a year ago, about specifically the Modernizer project, about how can we detect a mouse user. For this reason, I want to use hover-based stuff. Can I not just work out, oh, this was a mouse user and use that? If it's not a mouse user, then I'll do something else. And again, if you've got the time or the energy, you can read that. There's 80 comments a year ago already. There's probably a few more now. But the end result really is that no, you can't. The only way that you can detect somebody's, say, a touchscreen user is at the moment you get the first touch event. That's the only thing you can say for sure. Particularly now with hybrid devices and everything else. Yes, I'm a mouse user here nominally because I've got a touchpad, a trackpad, but I might still be using a finger on touchscreen. Vice versa, I might be on a nominally touch-only device, but I actually pair the mouse with it. So it's really about giving up control. It's similar to our old discussions of how can I detect what screen size my user's using, or those kind of situations. You have to give up control on that, actually realise you have to code for all potential inputs rather than trying to say this is a user that will only ever use a mouse or not. That gets into, and that's the converse Stu Cox, a good guy on the Modernizer team. He's also done a lot of writing on the subject. Good article there. Basically the converse. You can't detect a mouse user, you can't detect a touchscreen user. Coming at it from different sides, but the result is the same. You pretty much have to give up control on that. And it gets really more into a UX kind of UI discussion, which I'm not going to go into because I'm not that good with it. I just look at events and JavaScript on my devices, me. But it's about complementing your device. You can use hover-based stuff if you want to, but think about what happens if a user uses an input that doesn't have hover. Are there alternatives? And this is actually something that you should have already been thinking about anyway for keyboard users, because again, if you're triggering stuff on mouse over, you've already stopped keyboard users all along doing things. So it's more about thinking about the different ways users can get to that content. So no code on this at all. Right, mouse move doesn't track. The last kind of big point. How are we doing for time? I'm probably completely lost for time. Oh, okay. Right, you've got no plans until 12. Oh, yeah. So, mouse move doesn't track. We've seen that, or we've seen a different example. I'll see if I can find that one, because it's actually prettier. Particle, party. It's because I named them really shit names. There you go. So this is the kind of same thing. It works with a mouse, but if I refresh and I try, oops, yeah, Chrome's got the new touch kind of to move from one page to the next. You'll see that it only fires that one sacrificial mouse move. I can't actually track my finger over this because my script only listens to mouse move. Again, that's the reason why we're going to get that one sacrificial mouse move. So we've seen before about, oh well, great, we'll just double up events, we'll listen to touch end and click. Here, similar kind of approach, naively initially, we'll say, okay, well, the stuff I'm doing on mouse move, I know there's a touch move that actually fires as my finger moves over the screen. I'll listen to that as well. So assuming that this is the kind of idealized code I have, I've got my little handler that looks for, you know, client X and client Y, or whatever coordinate pair you're looking at in your script. That's currently hooked into mouse move. I'll just double it up, call the same handler on touch move. But if you do that, you'll find that the touch thing doesn't work out of the box. Now the reason for that is, going back to school, if you're listening to mouse events, this is the event object you get back a mouse event. And it's got those various screen X, screen Y, client X, client Y, blah, blah, blah. And then there's an extension to this that also then has page X and page Y. But those are the kind of attributes that you get in that object that you're listening to, which we used in our previous example. Now, touch events use a slightly different model. If you're listening to a touch event, this is the object you get back in your handler. You'll notice there's no actual coordinate pairs, and that's because touch events are designed from the ground up already to be multi-touch capable. So if you've got 2 or 3 fingers on the screen, you can't just have a single coordinate pair. It will have, it needs to have multiple coordinates, and those are actually stored in a new type of object called the touch list. So this is what you get touches, target touches, change touches, and I'll mention in a second what the difference is there. And then within that touch list, you get a whole series of individual touch objects, and they actually then contain the coordinates. Now, have I got a slide for that? Yeah. Basically, I'll tempt the demo gods to actually give you a slightly better idea, bless you, of what's going on here, just to show you the difference. Let's see if that works. Difference between these. Now, I've got the same problem. I need to find the actual touch list objects. There you go. So we've got touches. That's a bit small. Touches, target touches, and change touches. Touches are basically a finger anywhere on the screen. Even though I'm hooked into the test button in this case, I receive a move event, a touch move event, and in that event I get all the other fingers that might be completely unrelated to my object. They're not anywhere near it, but I get them. In this example, I've got 3 fingers on the screen. It's the white outer circles. So even though these 2 here are nowhere near the object and not actually firing any events on the object, I'm aware of them inside my script. Target touches, which is the middle circle, is fingers that, fingers that start, or touches that start on the object. They might then move out of the object, but it will still track them. So anything that starts inside the element that I'm listening on, even if it moves out, it's aware of those in the target touches. And change touches is kind of the difference between the last time I looked at what touch objects are there, what triggered the event to be fired. It's a bit of a bizarre concept. So it could be, if it's a touch start, what triggered that event to be fired was my first finger going on. If I then put a second finger on there, I might get another touch start, and change touches will only contain that second finger, even though both fingers are now on the screen. And if I move the first one, that will be the only one in the change touches. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry. In 90% of the cases, what you actually want is target touches, because you're only you've got your listeners on that object, you're really listening for what's actually happening on that object, what finger went on there. But it's something very peculiarly specific to touch events. You get these weird objects that that let you actually see any finger on the screen. It's lovely stuff. Give me an excuse to try this AirPlay thing. There we go. Right. So the upshot of all of that is that I can't just listen to X and Y coordinates as I normally would with my mouse. I need to be a bit more specific. In this case, I'm actually only listening to a single finger, and I'll make an assumption that in that touch list that I get, I'm just listening to the first touch object there. The order in which I get these objects in the touches, target touches, is actually can be completely random. So if there's 5 fingers on the screen, it's not necessarily true that the first one of those objects was the first finger that went on the screen. But in this case, I'm basically super simplifying the code here and saying I'm only interested in one single finger. I'm assuming that that will be the first element in target touches, and I grab the coordinates from there. Did that make any sense at all? It starts getting a little bit, change touches, what's that all about? So yeah, basically double up your events, but you then need to start thinking more about if it's touches, I need to start forking my code and doing extra weird stuff. And then as an example, this was the one that only listens to mouse. This is still the wrong one. But yeah, same difference. Here I'm doing that, I'm doubling up my mouse move and my touch move with the extra grab the first target touch, and you'll see that it does the same thing. It now works as well. With a lot of messing about with JavaScript that was required. So obviously now I can track finger movements. The next logical step from that is, hey, I can make everything swipeable now, and I can listen to a swipe left, a swipe right, and do stuff relating to that. Quick example of that would be, and I'm doing these from basic principles, so coding it completely from scratch. A simple thing here where just detecting swipes, left, right, up, down, that sort of stuff. Strangely, the projector's actually got better contrast than my screen. That's a first. So yeah, we can, the code behind this is exactly what you might have already done years ago for mouse interactions. You're just, looking at the delta X or delta Y over time. If it's below a certain threshold, assume that that will swipe, that kind of stuff. You can go as fancy or as simple, as in my case, as you want, but this is now something that you can code from basic principles if you want to, because you can now finally track. If you relied on mouse move, it didn't work. If you rely on touch move, you can. Slightly more useful examples will be things like carousels. Oops, wrong one. Should really make the text a bit bigger. So, yeah, completely naively coded again. You can do things like that now as well. Obviously, don't forget about mouse and keyboard. As I said before, don't make your entire website now only work. Everything's swipeable. The zero interface. It's all about manipulating content. Great if you've got a touchscreen, but what happens if somebody doesn't? If somebody, again, you've seen all the cases. Somebody's on a laptop. Somebody's paired a mouse with their touchscreen device, etc. If you're doing all of that stuff, tracking touch move, same way as with mouse move, it fires a lot. And particularly on kind of older devices, it's quite an important point to make, because if you're doing a lot of heavy calculations and stuff, don't try and do them on every single touch move that you get, otherwise you're going to kill the devices. Usually you want to do the absolute minimum on touch move, and usually that means just storing coordinates, and do the really heavy lifting at a set interval, or using a request animation frame, whatever. Just something that gives you a bit more control over, yes, I'm using, trigonometric functions to work out, Pythagoras to work out which way the user's swiping. Only do it, in controlled bursts, and not trying to do it 200 times a second, because even fast devices won't manage that. There are other techniques. You could debounce or throttle your events, so you can listen to only every 10th touch move if you wanted to, or assume that a lot of the same events fired close by, just reduce them to a single one, so the bouncing and throttling. There's ready-made scripts for that stuff here. I just had an example with limit.js. Depending on what you do, that might actually be good enough. Obviously, if you want to track something precisely around the user's finger, then this might not be the best approach because you start dropping points along the line. But depending on what you do, this might be an option. So why stop at a single point? We've seen we can track fingers now. We can track a single finger. We've seen that we get these. I always call them arrays, but that's probably wrong, and I'll get killed by JavaScript calls, but whatever they are. Touch list, objects, collections, things. As I said, we've seen these. You can just work your way through them, and you get all the touch points, and you can do fairly simple stuff, obviously like this. Is this the one I want? Yes. So, stuff like that. Always good for parties. Say, very, very naive code. It just goes through the touch list object. Not very useful.
Is there any limitation?
That would depend on the device. Well, the joke answer is usually 11. But in most of the cases it is. Let's try it. But on some devices I've seen that they only support 2 or 3 touch points. I think I've got some examples there. There are some problems with that. That's a bit dark. That's an iPad. Preventive, well, again, this goes down to Safari. Why do they hate the web so much and not let you do stuff? There's 4-finger gestures on iPad, and even with prevent default, and I've tried various other things, you can't override them. So as soon as you use 4 fingers and try my demo, it wants to swipe from one application to the next. And that was bad enough, but then in iOS 7, they introduced backwards and forwards swiping. If you're too close to the edge of the browser, the screen, again, it will try and swipe to previous or next page, and again, you can't prevent default it.
It does that with everything, though, doesn't it?
So,
it does that with everything, no
yeah.
matter what it is.
Yeah, even for native apps, I think there's threads of discussion about how can I stop this, and yeah, so that's again something to bear in mind if you want to do some kind of web app that does that, then you can't use more than 3 fingers, because on iPad then the 4th will start triggering that. And you need to, if you do something swipeable, keep it away from the edges, particularly for iPhone kind of stuff, because otherwise the user will just end up going back in history rather than, not the time machine, but you know what I mean. Marty, don't touch the side of the screen. I don't know. It's getting late, isn't it? So, multi-touch gestures, I can't actually remember what that is. Oh yeah. iOS Safari, we've seen these touch events and they were retrospectively Spectre, the W3C, and most browsers have them. Now, Safari also introduced gesture events back in iOS 2, and they're the only ones that have them because no other browser was interested in them, and I don't think they're actually used that much on the wild web. Probably a bit of a chicken and egg problem with that. But these gestures let you they fire when there's like a rotation or a pinch zoom, and you can get basic values out of them. In the event object that you get scale and rotation, which you can usually plug straight into some CSS transforms and stuff. So in theory they're quite nice, but Chrome, Firefox, Opera, all the other browsers don't have them. So unless you're doing something iOS specific, don't even bother. I've got an example of that if somebody's really got a burning interest, but you can, in most cases, work them out from basic principles again. Again, Pythagoras, you can work out with some fairly simple code, heavy because it uses the math and square root and stuff, code, but you can work that out and get to some reasonably impressive kind of results. I've got a picture of another here, yes. Again, this is fairly naive stuff, but this is kind of the culmination of looking at multiple touch points, working out what's the rotation. It's not 100% exact, it doesn't follow, you know, if I put two fingers on an image, it doesn't do exactly what a native app would do because I only rotate it by the center points of the image rather than between my fingers and stuff. But, you know, with enough maths and, you know, if you've got lots of spare time, you could probably make it do exactly what you would want it to do, kind of, if it was a real object. But, you know, it's a nice party piece anyway. Again, don't want to see this on every single website now, but it's something that you can do. So multi-touch, again, we already said don't do anything too, you know, don't make your whole site swipe enabled now because not everybody's got a touch screen. Think about mouse and keyboard users, or even for touch screen users, it's great that you can do multi-touch stuff, but don't rely too much on the fact that users will have multi-touch and will be able to do loads of stuff. There's lots of devices, some older devices that only have a single touch point. Admittedly, this is going back a few years. LG Optimus 2X on an old Android version. If you put more than one finger on there, it will still only recognize one touch point, but it will average between those two. That's the kind of weird stuff I encounter. But even more modern devices, the kind of entry-level Firefox OS phone, the ZTE Open, only has two simultaneous touch points. So good enough for pinch zooming, rotation, but if you're now thinking, great, it's a real touchscreen device, I'm going to do 3-finger gestures and what have you, there are devices even built today that don't have more than 2 points. And I think, looking at the time, I think I'm going to leave it at that because there's a whole now other chapter on what to do in Internet Explorer, which probably lasts about 30 minutes.
What's Internet Explorer? What's Internet Explorer?
What's Internet Explorer? That's a fantastic browser. I'll give you the short version of this without going into all the examples. So I'm going to speed up now into turbo mode. And basically say we've seen that the majority of browsers, pretty much now on touch devices, including, say, a Windows 8 laptop with a touchscreen, support touch events. And we've seen all the stuff about touch events. The one browser that doesn't support touch events is IE. On desktop machines with touchscreen and on Windows Phone 8, it doesn't mind. Before that, they didn't even exist, specific touch events. But in all those situations, IE doesn't actually have touch events, and that was a bit of a bummer. But what IE did in the latest versions is instead of trying to implement touch events, they actually invented a whole new category of events called pointer events, which when I first heard about that, I thought, they again invent something new, but it actually makes sense. I'm kind of a convert to it. And what pointer events do is we've seen all the effing about you have to do with. If you're doing mouse, this is the code you need to do, but you also need to listen to touch now, and probably need to do other stuff. In the future, if a new thing comes out, I don't know, Kinect style thing, you end up with loads of different types of events, and nobody's got time to reinvent the wheel every single time and write new event handlers. So what pointer events do is they actually try to be an umbrella event handling for anything that's pointer-like, whether it's a finger or a mouse pointer or a stylus. Those are the 3 cases that we have at the moment, but it's also extensible. So also say for instance the Xbox One, if you're doing like Kinect style, activating things, that will also count as a pointer, and they've actually demoed that a few weeks ago. So it's kind of a new event model that tries to cover anything that a user might be doing. Because in the majority of cases, as a developer, yes, there are situations where I want to know, was this a finger or was this a mouse? But most of the time, I just don't care how the user activated a control. I just want to know the user activated a control and then react to that. So this is where pointer events come in. And they actually spec'd it from the start, so they didn't do the Apple way of we invented it and it's our toy and then threatened with patents, but they actually took it straight to the W3C. It's being worked on. I'm part of the working group on that as well, so I'm biased, I'm sorry. But it's actually quite good. It's not a not invented here approach. There's actually, when they released it, they wrote a Chrome version, a test Chromium version that actually implemented some of this as a proof of concept. You know, Microsoft doing open source, who would have thought that? And there are bugs in the Chromium project and in Mozilla about implementing implementing pointer events. So it's something that the other browsers are now looking at doing as well. So it's not just an IE only thing. What about Apple? They had a bug, resolve won't fix for now, so because they don't like it, they have problems with that. So forget about Safari for now. Other browsers are interested, so it's something that you will be seeing in Firefox and Chrome as well. I'm not going to bother you with too much detail, but basically what you see is it's almost an exact like for like of mouse events. So where you have mouse over, you'll now get pointer over. This is also the compatibility events we saw before in the touch event model. You first got all the touch stuff, then a potential delay, and then mouse compatibility. Here they're fired all in line, so there's no delay happening between, say, the pointer over and the mouse compatibility mouse over. There will be a delay round about here just before the click, but this is basically new. There's the whole sequence is newer. There is a similar kind of feature detect. You can say, does this browser support pointer events? But at this point, it's not a naive assumption that you make, or just because it supports touch, it's a touch screen. Here you're just saying it's pointer events, which then still covers mouse and touch and stylus. So even if you use something like this to then hook it to, in this case I'll just listen to pointer events, you haven't killed mouse or keyboard, or not keyboard yet. You haven't killed mouse or stylus at that point, just because you're listening to pointer events, and pointer events cover the variety of devices. Lots of examples. I'll try to get to the meaty stuff. So most of the stuff is exactly the same. Have a look at the slides, that's all I can say. We saw before that the event object is different when we got the touch, when we listen to touch events versus mouse events. Another advantage of pointer events is they use exactly the same event object instead of inventing their own new one. I'll skip that slide because I didn't see it for the trees as I was going past it. They extend basically the normal mouse event. Upshot of that is you don't have to fork your code and say, if it's, you know, yes, I'm calling the same function, but then check, is there a client X, client Y, otherwise go here. You can use exactly the same code. Pretty much, if your code listened to mouse events before and did stuff, you can pretty much like for like use that and now just listen to pointer events instead, and it's likely to work. There will be some backwards compatibility issues, particularly for browsers that are now supporting touch events. Will they also support pointer events, and how will that work? That's an interesting question at the moment because, as I said, the whole event model is different, where the delay happens is different in these two models. The whole sequence of when the mouse events are being fired is different. That's still being discussed, so particularly browsers like Chrome that currently do support touch events. Yes, they're planning to implement pointer events, but how is that going to mesh? That's still being debated. So it is coming, but how that will exactly manifest itself, we'll see. There's a whole community group that's trying to find kind of what are the pain points of this future in which we need to support maybe both for legacy reasons, touch events, and in the future pointer events. There are polyfills already for pointer events, so if I've sold you on that by skipping all my slides that explain how great they are, and you want to do it right now, you can already code for pointer events. There are polyfills like hand.js, which was done by Microsoft themselves, which basically on any browser today, you can include that and start coding to pointer over, pointer out, blah, 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 and it will work. If you like your frameworks to be 800 megabytes in size, you can get things like Polymer, which brings the entire future of the web into your current browser. It's a Google project. Anybody heard of Polymer? Anybody using it? But yeah, it's a monster of it's a gigantic polyfill. You don't have to use it all, but that's basically where primarily Google are testing some far out future technologies. Things like Shadow DOM, if you've heard of that, was first introduced as a big polyfill, so they can start testing how does this actually work in a real browser before they commit to implementing it in code in, say, Chrome itself. So it's a giant thing, but as part of that, it has pointer events as well. There are utility libraries, because life's too short to hand code all that stuff. Yes, yeah, it's good that I can fill my evenings doing Pythagoras to work out swipe events. There are utility libraries that have done all that and make it easier for you. The fantastically named Hammer.js, which I'm actually going to open here. It doesn't play music. I think he's missed a trick on that. But basically, this implements all that stuff that I showed you before. I coded it from basic principles, the swipes and the pinches. Does it do that? Yeah. It fires events. Basically, it's a library. You put it in your page, and you can listen to a new type of synthetic events. Like, there you go. It's got that there. You can then write code like that. Just listening to double tap, or listening to swipe to the right or to the left, that sort of stuff. Because yeah, nobody's going to sit there and actually hand code their own version of swipe code. So very useful. Big, the heavy frameworks, particularly mobiles, things like touch, all that stuff. They seem to be pretty okay, kind of papering over all the problems and giving you methods that are simple enough to use in your code. I'd be careful because I've not tested them all myself. Just check that they don't make weird assumptions like that. That quick fix to say if it supports touch, just listen to touch end. So start testing it on devices that also have a keyboard and touch, because they might be doing some weird things behind the scenes that you're not even aware of. Debugging and testing. Most browsers on desktop nowadays have some kind of emulation functionality. In Firefox and in Chrome, you can emulate touch events if you're doing stuff. You've got the responsive view in Firefox, and here in Chrome DevTools, you can enable touch emulation. Be aware though that the emulation is often not exactly right. Again, I've been a sad bastard and filed bugs against those projects because the order isn't quite the same. The takeaway at the time was don't get too obsessed about this is the exact order because it might be different. But yeah, this will give you a slightly skewed picture of what events are actually being fired. So don't rely purely on this for testing. So that was Chrome, this is Firefox. So things like, it still fires a few mouse events where it shouldn't because this is on the desktop and you're moving the mouse over. So it doesn't always just emulate what a touchscreen user would. There is a useful thing that's Chrome specific. You can actually listen to any events that are being fired on a particular element, so you don't have to write yourself specific kind of console logs or anything else. You can just say, I'm interested in just seeing a list of any event being fired to this particular object. One little console command, and then anything that happens, whether it's touch or mouse, you will just send that directly to the console without having to console log and change all your code. You can do remote debugging, it works there as well. And if you haven't had enough of this topic after me ranting for about an hour and a bit, there's loads of other articles, and I'll see you tomorrow morning and discuss them. So with that, and with apologies for pretty much jumping over the entire pointer events thing, I'll say thank you very much, and if you've got any questions, or if you just want to go, my brain is oozing out my ear, then yeah, whatever, thank you. Cool.
Any questions?
Is there, have you got a note of that YouTube
Oh, sorry, the slides are on SlideShare. We can tweet them out as well.
Yeah.
All of that stuff is there. Yeah.
What are the most common flaws that you see in day-to-day websites that sort of make you cringe and think that could be easily fixed?
Well, as I say, the main one I still see is that if it supports touch events, I'll just listen to touch. Because, as I say, that was true 5 years ago maybe, because you didn't have hybrid. Well, even then you had, but very few common hybrid devices. But now it's almost impossible to get a Windows 8 laptop that isn't touchscreen enabled. So they become far more common use now. I'll admit that something like, I've got an iPhone but I've paired a keyboard with it is more of an edge case.
Yeah.
But yeah, devices like this, I think will just become more common. Things that transform that. It's a tablet, but then if I'm near a Bluetooth keyboard, I can start using that as a keyboard. And it's, as I say, it's similar to our discussions about screen size and how can I force my users to only be in this particular environment. It's more about giving away controls and realizing I can't really exactly say this is a mouse user, this is a touchscreen user. So it's about rethinking how your interactions work. I mean, a lot of it will come down to UX. Good but weird example is if you try Microsoft Office on a touch-enabled device, on a touch laptop. If you're selecting text, if you're using a mouse, it will just let you select text. If you're using touch, it will actually create two grabbable things that are slightly underneath the text, so that lets you do that. That's more of a UX decision. But it's about thinking, how can I make the same interface work in different situations? It doesn't mean that it has to be the same, but you can offer the same functionality in slightly different ways. But especially not making assumptions and saying, well, I only code my site for mouse users, which you shouldn't have had in the first place anyway because of keyboard users. But so this now brings it back home to roost. Same with developers who never cared about keyboard users and did everything on Hover, all of a sudden care about it because they now can't do it on their iPhone. So it's what goes around comes around. Yeah.
What about the trackpads that you get on more modern laptops now? Let you do pinch and things?
That isn't sent to the browser. That's OS based. So the OS itself will intercept if it was like a pinch gesture or something like that. So like Magic Trackpad as well, things like that. Or if you do something like Leap, I've ordered a Leap ages ago. I finally received it. I played with it for about an hour, and then I put it back in the box and never looked at it again. So it's a cute device, but if you're actually in normal use, it will emulate. The software will emulate a mouse. So you can use Leap to control web pages, but the web page actually only sees it as if it was a mouse. You can then run a local node server, which then interfaces with the Leap and gives you access to finger coordinates and everything else. But that requires that you're actually running that software locally as well. So in effect, it's just a mouse, and that's pretty much what you get with trackpads that do crazy things, swipes and stuff like that. That's usually never sent down to the point of the actual application or your JavaScript. Same with that case with the four fingers swiping between apps or the fingers on the edge of an iPhone going backwards and forwards in history. That's never even gets to the JavaScript. That's intercepted way before by the OS or by the browser itself. Go on.
Where do you see things converging in the future in terms of touch events, pointer events, and what's different about the...
Well, I think pointer events are interesting, and as I said, I am biased because I've actually worked in the working group. Well, I came in later after the first version was out, and I helped them. I say I helped them, sounds a bit grand. I had input into rewriting some of the stuff to make it a bit more developer friendly. That, for instance, because I'm so obsessed with event sequences, I actually included a new section that just shows typically when you tap on something, this is the event sequence that you would get for pointer events, and just kind of demodifying some of the language that they use. But it's, to me, that's the most sensible approach. I'm going to go back and see if I can find that slide. Actually, I'm going to go out of full screen mode and actually find that slide. Because the nice thing with, I talked about pointer events, or skimmed pointer events, saying that they are, they cover everything. So, if you just care about has the user activated something, you can just listen to that and it will cover touch and stylus and what have you. If you then do want to specifically know the objects, there we go, you can see that. This is the bit where pointer events extend the mouse event object. You can actually work out the pointer type. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You can say, okay, I'm only going to react to pointer down or pointer up and not do anything specific. So anything, whether the user is using a finger or a stylus or something, I just run my function. But if you do care about it, you can then distinguish based on that. You can say, well, but if it was a mouse, do this, and it could bring up a context menu. If it was touch, maybe bring out, spin out a radial menu that comes out, or if it's a pen, do something completely different. So I think this kind of approach, where you've got a class of events that kind of encompass everything, but still let you actually do something specific if you do want to do it, that's probably where we're going to go, because we're only going to get more of these devices and interfaces, things like, as I said, the Xbox One, Kinect style things, head tracking, motion control stuff, remote controls that only have directional pads. We've already got quite a few of these different input modes, and just inventing new events for each one of these is just not going to happen. So I see it as more of this future that we're going to have. We're going to have a way of just reacting to intent rather than specific events for specific devices. I mean, you can argue that pointer events still are very low level because you're still dealing with, something went over an object, something was pressed down, something was lifted again, which still has to be translated into what's a pointer down in the case of, head tracking. So at the moment,
You'd have to come
devices...
up with something else for that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and there is a thing that, it's called Indie UI, which is probably, it's not really covering all situations, but that it comes from the accessibility side in the UI, and it looks more at looking at a class of events that show intent rather than what actually happened. So instead of listening to the pointer went down, then the user moved the pointer to the left and then released it, having something more high level that says the user wants to go to the next page, and then hooking into kind of a really abstract event of that type, or the user wants to activate this. How they then do it, whether there's a button that they press down and then up again, or whether they nod at their head or whatever. You really want intent rather than the raw, they moved this, they pressed this. But that's a long way off, I think. In the UI, there's a bit of development. I think in Safari they've got minimal support for it, but it's not going to happen. But in the far future, that's what I would see. And then you start building your script and your code more about, the user wants to do this, and then it could adapt to each individual device without you having to code it twice or 3 times. So the device itself would know what its way of saying, I want to go to the next page is, and then it would just fire that generic event and translate whatever the motion was or whatever itself, and just sends the intent to the script. Sorry, it's getting very esoteric there.
It saves a lot of work for people as well.
Exactly. So, sorry.
Do you think there's any good reason for Apple's not adopted the pointer events, or do you think it just comes down to Microsoft?
Oh, it's particularly Apple. It's not Apple, it's the WebKit project, which is pretty much led by Apple. They've got a weird relationship with standards anyway. Sometimes it comes down to they didn't invent it, so often that's the case. Or or they think they've got a patent on some technology and they just don't want to collaborate with people. You know, the fact that Apple don't have, or they have developer evangelists, but they don't actually ever go anywhere except for their own Apple events. It's weird. It's weird. I know a few Apple kind of developers, and in some groups they're really good. They collaborate. But with other stuff like this, they just seem to. Sometimes from the outside it just looks like they're blocking it because they didn't. You know, it's not their toy, and they want to be in control of it. And they'd rather invent their own spec rather than share something and collaborate. But it's weird. Some people, well, me included, starting to say that Safari is becoming the kind of IE of old. There's a lot of stuff that, well, Chrome, they're always on overdrive and they're pushing new standards all the time, and usually in Google fashion, killing half of them because they didn't succeed, but at least they keep churning forward. Whereas Apple's always, you never know, they never talk to developers until they release a new version of iOS, and here's all the new stuff. Don't know. Anyway, so we'd have to ask somebody from Apple, but they're not allowed to talk to us.
Oh no, there's no one here.
No. So yeah. There we go.
Cool.